In this lesson, we will talk about one of the most commonly encountered question tasks for critical reasoning format questions on the verbal section of the executive assessment, and those are going to be questions that ask you to strengthen an argument. So let's first just recap the question logistics for critical reasonings on the executive assessment. First, assume that you're going to see 3 to 5 of these unique question types in the 14 question verbal section of the test. You're going to assume that there will be 1 to 3 critical reasonings in each 7-question half, and in many instances, in a harder second half, you are likely to encounter more of these question types because they are a little bit more complex and they generally take a little bit more time. And we know that time management is definitely one aspect of the exam as far as what it's trying to test in a test taker. We also know that there's always going to be a single paragraph pertaining to a unique question test. So, what this means is that all critical reasonings on the test are going to be self contained. So, one critical reasoning does not affect any other question on the section, unlike reading comprehension passages, which have 3 or 4 questions tied to them. And these logistics are going to inform some strategic best practices for critical reasoning questions. First, these questions should take the most amount of time on average because the details matter. So you want to spend a little bit more than the approximately 2 minutes and 10 seconds that you'd have overall for the verbal section per question and go to about 2.5 minutes per question on critical reasoning, just because you do have to note all of the details. They certainly matter when you're trying to address these questions. But you're going to have a pretty hard maximum of 3 minutes for any individual critical reasoning. Now, because these questions are assumed to take longer than sentence corrections for certain, and quite possibly on average the reading comprehension as well, you do want to note the task of the question first before you engage the prompt, because you may decide that you're actually going to skip your critical reasonings. And if you recognize that you're not really even understanding what the question is asking, you may want to engage in this tactic of skipping critical reasonings on the first half, first pass through a half, to make sure that you see everything else. And if you have any trouble finishing the exam under the 30-minute time frame for that 14-question verbal section, you may just decide for each 7-question half, I'm going to see everything else first and then come back to the critical reasonings. But when you do engage with the critical reasoning, you have to force yourself to take targeted notes to ensure that you are engaging with the information, and then put yourself in a position to proactively address what the specific question task should be with a prediction. And these are, of course, going to be the primary question format to guess and skip in the second half of the verbal section if you have fewer than 15 minutes remaining after question 7. Remember that our goal is to hit the harder difficulty second half of the verbal section, really every section on the executive assessment. So if you're under 15 minutes left, you may decide to just skip a critical reasoning to get back on pace. So now that we've talked about critical reasonings overall, let's talk about what may be the most frequently occurring task for critical reasonings on the exam, and those are strengthen the argument tasks. So how do you identify strengthen the argument task first? Well, you need to recognize the reference to an argument in the question stem. So the question itself is going to say which of the following will strengthen the argument. And of course, task words such as strengthen, support, justify, or even the transition since and then a blank following may be indicators that you need to strengthen the argument that's provided. And you have to beware, however, of mistaking an inference task, seeking an answer choice that must be true or supported by the information in the paragraph, rather than thinking that's a strengthen task. The word support itself is the most ambiguous task word for critical reasoning. And if the question is seeking to support a choice, that's inference. If your question is seeking a choice or additional information, if true, to support the prompt, then it's a strengthen task. And the fill in the blank questions are generally going to be either inference or strengthen as well. And if you see that word since, that's a pretty good indicator that you're really looking at what we call a since strengthen. Now, strategically for strengthen the argument questions, they are one of the more straightforward critical reasoning tasks. So we want to take advantage of them when we see them. You always want to begin by reading the prompt and identifying the explicit conclusion of the argument once you've identified the strengthen the argument task. You'll then consider categorically identifying a common argument type to broadly predict possible support. And you need to focus on your common wrong argument answer choices to eliminate incorrect options. But if you find a choice that rather closely matches your prediction of what the correct answer should have done to more specifically strengthen the argument based on the structure of it, then you can move a little bit more quickly through the process of elimination. So let's revisit our argumentation equation. And we know that all arguments ultimately lead up to a conclusion. And that conclusion is going to be the explicitly stated subjective opinion that requires some sort of evidence as support. And that evidence comes in the form of a premise. And that premise is going to be your explicitly objective facts that are presented in order to provide support. But what comes in between the premise and the conclusion in the argumentation equation is what we're going to be addressing in our question task, which is the assumption. And the assumption is going to be an individual or set of facts that are unstated but must be true to link the premise logically to the conclusion. So how does this play in specifically with strengthen tasks? Well, if you're trying to strengthen an argument, you need to locate additional information to show that the implicit assumption or assumptions linking the premises to the conclusion are in fact likely to be true. So you're saying these assumptions are actually relatively strong. And arguments generally can be categorized in multiple ways, but if you could focus more closely on the specifics of the premise and how the argument ultimately reaches its conclusion, that will help you to more directly and broadly predict how a choice could support the claim based on just categorical realities about how certain types of arguments are structured. So let's consider some of those common arguments, starting with an analogy. An analogy basically is saying because something's like something happened in one scenario and a very similar scenario, it's going to happen as well. So any argument based on an analogy is assuming that the items that are presented in the argument, in the premise, and the conclusion are comparable in relevant ways. And your likely support for an analogy argument is going to eliminate possibly relevant differences in between those items, or explicitly articulate that a relative similarity or relevant similarity is absolutely certain. Another common argument that you'll encounter is one of representation, and that's where you take a sample and use it to make a conclusion about a larger whole. And all arguments using representation assume that whatever is being used as evidence is representative of that larger whole population in the conclusion. And there are several ways that you can potentially make an assumption that isn't necessarily warranted. So, in order to support that assumption, you want to show that terms used in the evidence and conclusion that may be slightly different are in fact interchangeable or commensurate, and that whatever the provided sample is always analogous to the overall population in meaningful ways. So you're basically saying that I chose this evidence that is a small sample that I can then extrapolate to a larger conclusion. So let's take a look at a sample strengthened task and see how we could potentially try to predict some of these common supporting evidences. So as always, we read the task first. We've got which of the following, if true, most strengthens the argument above. So we recognize the key term indicating a strengthened task. It says strengthened. Sometimes it's not that hard to identify a strengthened task. Then you need to read the prompt and try to note the types of evidence that are provided to possibly recognize a common argument. So starting from the beginning, we've got many types of yogurt are fortified with nutritional supplements, and some of these yogurts provide more than 3 times the recommended daily values of those supplements. Therefore, someone who eats yogurt regularly is likely to consume more than the recommended daily value for certain nutritional supplements. So we've got this quantifier of many types of yogurt. And that may make us think that this sample is being extrapolated to another version or another size or another population in the conclusion. And we see in the conclusion that that's ultimately what's happening. We've got someone, so because of many types of yogurt, someone who eats yogurt regularly, another sample size, is likely to consume more than the recommended daily value for certain nutritional supplements. So we might be able to identify that common pattern of representation, and that will allow us to broadly predict what the correct answer should do to strengthen the argument based on the representation structure. So we need to find an answer that shows that many types of yogurt is a representative sample that will lead to consuming more than the recommended daily value of some certain natural nutritional supplements. So now we'll bring in our answer choices. And we then have to work through the process of elimination based on common wrong argumentation reasons, starting with vague impact. So, vague impact, if you can focus on it, becomes a wonderful way to eliminate for critical reasoning questions on the executive assessment. Because some nutritional supplements, well, we don't even know if those are the nutritional supplements in yogurts, so we can eliminate that immediately. Then we want to consider things that need additional information, such as choice B, which introduces the idea that yogurt is less healthy than bran flakes. Okay, I don't know how healthy bran flakes are. And you can't use outside knowledge if you happen to be a regular eater of bran flakes and know their nutritional value. You have to stick to what is presented in the argument, and we know nothing about bran flakes, so choice B definitely needs additional information to properly evaluate whether it would strengthen the argument, so we can eliminate B as well. Then we have to note task reversals, and task reversals are going to be additional information that actually weakens the argument instead of strengthens. So in this case, for choices C and E, we can see that it's basically saying yogurt is less healthy. Now, this is not necessarily like directly related to the idea of the certain nutritional supplements and exceeding the recommended daily value. But no yogurt containing all recommended nutritional supplements, well, again, is that going to be the one that has the supplements? I need to know how many of those there are. There's a lot of additional information needed here, but at the very least, it's not strengthening the idea about getting your certain nutritional supplements. And yogurt alone not sufficing for a balanced diet. Well, balanced diet is actually not discussed in terms of health or the supplements here. And again, even if this were extrapolated and you make several additional assumptions, this would probably weaken the idea about someone eating yogurt and consuming more than the recommended daily value for certain nutritional supplements. Whereas choice A, we've got yogurts with nutritional supplements comprise more than 75% of all yogurts available. Well, this is saying that many types of yogurt is actually a majority and a vast majority of all the yogurts that are available. So, therefore, if someone eats yogurt regularly, they are more than likely going to engage or eat those types of yogurt that have the nutritional supplements, thereby supporting the assumption that many types of yogurt wasn't a small percentage of all yogurts, even though you could have a lot of yogurt, but it ultimately ends up being a small proportion of the greater population. So, choice A addresses the possible assumptions regarding the sample, not necessarily representing the whole, but in this case it does, and A would be our correct answer. So then we can look at some additional common arguments, including data and evidence interpretation. You may be thinking to yourself, wasn't that last example data and evidence interpretation? And kind of, yeah, it is. And it's certainly, showing that idea that the different argument types often overlap, they can be shared, but a data and evidence interpretation style argument assumes that there is no other reasonable interpretation of the data or evidence. And in this case, again, it was that idea that many actually was a sizable proportion of all yogurt populations. And so it provided the support, which in many cases with data and evidence interpretation is going to be additional data or numbers or evidence to support the conclusion's reasoning. So you're going to show that there really is no other way to interpret the data or evidence because you've got additional information that supports that interpretation. Then we go to a causality. And a causality, in its simplest terms, is that because A happens, then B happens. And just about every argument type, if you can't identify it as a more specific data and evidence interpretation, representative sample, analogy, or ultimately the plan that we'll be looking at next, can be forced into the structure of causality. Because A happened, B happened. And all causalities will assume two things. One, that there are no other possible causes or outcomes. That because A happened, B was guaranteed to happen. And because A happens, there's not going to be something else that happens. And additionally, that whatever the circumstance is not merely a coincidence, so that it can ultimately be to a degree replicable. And in order to support a causality, your correct answer should eliminate the possibility of another cause or outcome, or show another instance of the same phenomenon, so thereby showing that it's not necessarily a coincidence. Then our last structure of argument is going to be a plan or recommendation. And plans or recommendations are going to assume that the plan or recommendation is going to be executed, and that whatever that plan or recommendation is will work. But the key here is that it will work according to whatever the defined metric of success is. And that's what your likely support is going to be when you're looking for a strengthen answer for a plan or recommendation argument. You want to find something new that shows that the execution of the plan or recommendation will result in success specifically as it's defined by the argument. Not just that the plan does good things, but does exactly the good thing that it was intended to do. So let's take a look at one more example critical reasoning. And once again, we're going to read the task first. So we've got which of the following, if true, most supports the conservationist argument. So we recognize the term support, and we see that there's the word argument, which is kind of a big hint that says this is an argumentation question. And we can see that we're looking for the following to support the prompt. So this is strengthen as a task, not an inference task. Then we'll read the prompt from the beginning and see if we can note the presence of a plan or recommendation based argument. So the conservationist says bald eagles are uniquely viewed as symbols of free wilderness and foster sympathy from the general public, unlike any other wild animal. Because sympathy often generates political will, addressing the conservation needs of all species should begin by saving the bald eagle. So we see the phrase should begin, that's indicating a recommendation. So therefore, we've got a recommendation or plan based argument. Then we, as always, have to identify the explicit conclusion. You'll probably want to take a predictive note here to say what our prediction will be, but you can see I've helped a little bit here by highlighting. Unfortunately, can't do that on the exact exam, but we know that our conclusion is that addressing the conservation needs of all species should begin by saving the bald eagle. So to broadly predict what the correct answer should do, we want to show that this plan is going to work. So we need to find an answer choice that shows that the plan to save the bald eagle will work to address the conservation needs of all species, because that is the goal of the plan as expressed in the argument. So then we bring in our answer choices and we'll process eliminate again based on common and wrong argumentation reasons, such as vague impact. And we've got a couple of really nice vague ones here. We've got bald eagles can be seen on many governmental seals. Wonderful. I have no idea what that has to do with this conclusion, so we can eliminate that pretty quickly. Additionally, we've got the general public can be fickle in pursuing environmental causes. Be careful not to make some assumptions of your own, because you may say, well, that shows that they're not going to be able to follow through unless they go with the bald eagle. Well, this is can be fickle. It doesn't say they will be. And pursuing environmental causes, I don't know if that's actual like animal conservation. So you've got to make sure that you interpret the terms literally when you're considering them as possible choices. Then we've got things that need additional information. Choice D says free wilderness itself is in need of dedicated conservation efforts. Okay, there's a lot of vagaries here as well. What kind of efforts, how much of the free wilderness, and honestly, if we're thinking about free wilderness being in need of dedicated conservation efforts too, then that may be a little bit earlier than saving the bald eagle. We need to save the free wilderness before we can save the bald eagle, and that actually kind of works as a task reversal, as does choice A, because choice A says the number of bald eagles in the wild has increased significantly in the past decades. Well, if they've increased significantly, we probably don't need to save the bald eagle and should probably go save other animals first. So that too would weaken rather than the sought task of strengthening the argument. But then we consider choice C, and it's incredibly bland. We've got political will is necessary to sustain efforts that go beyond initial goals. We see political will right before the conclusion, and it says because sympathy often generates political will, but we don't know that that political will necessarily is going to lead to addressing the conservation needs of other species beyond the bald eagle. But choice C says that that assumption is true, because political will is needed to sustain efforts that go beyond initial goals. And we know the initial goal is to get the bald eagle, but our plan wants to go beyond the initial goal and get to the conservation needs of all species. So choice C directly addresses the success of the plan and is our correct answer. So when you engage with strengthened tasks, first, obviously, you need to identify the strengthened task by recognizing a key indicator term and just the presence of an argument with a main conclusion. Then you want to read the prompt as written, paying close attention to the type of information provided in the premise, and always note the explicit conclusion that's provided. If you can identify a common argument, you can more specifically predict what the correct answer should do to strengthen that argument based on the type that you've identified. But if you can't identify a common argument, then you can just use the generic prediction of find info to support the conclusion that whatever the conclusion is for that particular argument. And as always, you'll want to seek a match to your prediction if you can find one. then you can move more quickly through elimination because you feel pretty good about your prediction and the choice that matches it. But you can always rely on eliminating choices that fail to address that task as well, using our common wrong answer reasons that we saw in the examples. So let's head on over to the whiteboard and take a look at a couple of more examples so you can see how you'll actually engage with your scratch work when you encounter these types of questions on the EA. So here we have a sample critical reasoning style question on the board. We put our answer choices A through E just for process of elimination purposes. We got a little line over top for a task once we identify it, and we start by just reading up top. We see which of the following most logically completes the passage. So this must be either an inference task or a since strengthened task. And we've got a since with a little line after it, so that indicates, even though we just skipped to the end without reading the whole paragraph, that we are most likely going to have one of those since strengthened tasks where the conclusion is most likely to immediately precede the since that will then provide the evidence for said conclusion, thereby strengthening the argument. So we'll read the paragraph from the beginning. A digital streaming platform recently pivoted from primarily showing family-friendly content to focusing more on explicitly sexual and violent programs. After this change, some companies pulled their advertisements from the platform. Clearly, the change in content has led to a loss in revenue for the streaming platform since blank. So we're going to just put a little PS for predicted strength in here. And we can see that the conclusion is as was anticipated right before the since. Now, obviously, on the exam, you can't do my little brackets there, but you'll want to take your note by just synthesizing your prediction with the conclusion. And let's just imagine we don't see a common argument structure here. So we could just say, as our predicted way to strengthen, find info to show that the change from FF content for family friendly to sex and violent content has led to a loss or down revenue for our streaming platform. And if you can't identify a clear common argument structure, this is all you do. You just say, okay, I need to find information to show that this conclusion did in fact happen if I'm looking at a strengthened task. So starting with choice A, we've got its change in content, meaning the streaming platform, has also been criticized by some prominent politicians. Well, some prominent politicians couldn't be much more vague if it tried. And so we can eliminate that pretty much immediately because we don't know that those politicians directly influenced the pulling of the advertisements. We don't even know how many some is. There's way too many questions about that vague qualifier. Now, for choice B, we have the average spend by advertisers did not increase after the content strategy shift by the streaming platform. Now, the average spend by advertisers is certainly going to be relevant. And we know that there was a content strategy shift. So even if I don't immediately recognize the relationship between choice B and how it does actually affect the conclusion, at the very worst, I'm going to use my little tilde or squiggle and say I'm going to hold this because there's nothing that is immediately vague, weakening, or requiring additional outside information in choice B. Now, choice C, ratings have increased by more than 50% since the shift was implemented. Well, ratings having gone up, that could help, but we don't necessarily know. It still requires additional information because without knowing that those ratings led directly to increased ad sales from some other advertisers, we don't have the evidence that there's been this loss in revenue. And in fact, if it is applied and we make that logical leap, it's actually going to weaken more likely because it would show that there'd be an increase in ratings, which, again, we're going to have to make a logical leap, say that's going to cause people to spend more, but it's certainly not going to make them spend less. So it's going to need additional information, or at best, it's weakening when we wanted to strengthen. Choice D, we've got once again, some of the family-friendly content was picked up for distribution by a rival platform. Again, that could not be more vague if it tried. And for choice E, we talk about older viewers. Well, that once again needs additional information. And at best, may weaken, because it's saying that we've gone to theoretically older viewers with the sexual and violent programs as opposed to family friendly. But again, there's way too many logical leaps that are required to make this connection solid. Whereas choice B really does hit on the issue, which is that if the average spend did not increase after the content strategy shift, well, then by losing some companies, you're losing overall amount. Whereas if the average spend had gone up, you might have individual advertisers offsetting the loss of those some other companies that pulled their advertisements. And therefore, choice B addresses how to strengthen the argument pretty directly. So let's go ahead and take a look at one more example here down on the board here. So setting up the scratch work one more time, we've got A, B, C, D, E, put a little line over top. And this time we're looking to justify the reasoning above. And justify is a slightly more obscure strengthen term, but this is really just asking us to strengthen. I mean, you could use the justify term as well, but it's really just a slight variation on our strengthen task process that we're going to apply here. So we read from the beginning. We've got generally governments respond to public criticism of necessary social services by expanding oversight and regulation of those services. However, an increase in regulations can quickly result in higher costs for consumers. The public is currently criticizing early childcare services, but in this case, families should not necessarily expect to incur greater costs as a result. So we can see that we are clearly dealing with costs, and that oftentimes, whenever we're dealing with actual numbers, can be categorized as a data or evidence interpretation style question. So our predicted strength in here, we can just say, is to find info to show that the evidence of an increase in costs does not necessarily mean an increase in costs for ECS, for early childcare services specifically. So we're going to focus on that specific issue of the costs. So the number of early childcare providers has remained largely static for the past decade. Well, the number is an incredibly vague quantity, because it could be like a million, it could be 1,000, it could be 10. So that needs additional information. And we don't know how them staying at a static amount affects the cost for early childcare services specifically. Now, in public surveys, government provided services are rated more poorly than comparable privately provided services. Well, okay, we've introduced the idea of privately provided services this time, and that too needs additional information. We're talking about the government, and we're talking about criticizing early childcare services and regulations, and we actually never really said that they were going to be government provided services even. So there's a whole lot of additional information needed to make B actually address the direct conclusion that the families should not expect to incur greater costs because the public is criticizing early childcare services. Then we've got, in the last election cycle, some politicians. Oh, that's wonderful. So once again, we've got a delightful vague qualifier. Now, recently passed legislation provides vouchers that parents of young children can use to pay for necessary social services. And if we are focusing specifically on the cost, this provides our cost offset. And we're not going to come up with vouchers in our head and be like, ooh, clearly it's vouchers. But once we're focused on the cost as the evidence, we might be a little bit more prepared to recognize when the costs are being addressed in a choice. Then we've got early child care services are often a significant portion of a family budget. Well, that's wonderful, but again, are often a significant portion of the family budget. If they are a significant portion, then I mean, it seems like if anything, that's going to weaken the argument, but it probably needs more additional information as well. So you can see when you have an idea of what a common argument structure is, how you can address these strengthened tasks, as well as when you don't identify a common argument structure, how you can still use the same process broadly to address these tasks. So go ahead and practice some strengthened critical reasoning tasks on your own to improve at this specific task that you are likely to encounter on the exam.